An NFL dynasty didn't fall apart on the field. It didn't end with a blown coverage, a bad play call, or a missed kick. It ended in a private conversation that most fans were never supposed to know about. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a Baltimore Ravens player walked into the home of Steve Bisciotti and sat down for what can only be described as an intervention. This wasn't small talk. This wasn't frustration after a tough loss. It was a blunt, behind closed doors breakdown of everything that had quietly gone wrong inside one of the NFL's most stable organizations. And when that player walked out, the fate of John Harbaugh, a man who had spent 18 years building Baltimore into a model franchise, was essentially sealed. That's why the official explanations never quite added up. A missed field goal didn't erase nearly 2 decades of success. One uneven season didn't suddenly outweigh a Super Bowl, multiple playoff runs, and a reputation for leadership. Something deeper was happening, and it had been building long before the season ended. Behind the scenes, frustration was growing, not just about wins and losses, but about communication, adaptability, and direction. Players felt disconnected, messages felt stale, and the most important voice in the building, the franchise quarterback, needed something different to move forward. This wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about leverage, about whether an owner should protect the past or secure the future. And when Steve Bisciotti was forced to choose, he made the most controversial decision of his ownership tenure, one that shocked the league, divided fans, and redefined what power really looks like inside an NFL organization. Because once that conversation happened, there was no going back. To understand why this decision happened so fast, and why it was so final, you have to understand how Steve Bisciotti operates. Because he's not an owner who reacts emotionally, and he's definitely not one who hides behind tradition. Bisciotti didn't inherit the Ravens. He built his wealth the same way he's always run his teams, by identifying talent early, listening to the people closest to the work, and cutting ties when something no longer scales. Long before he owned an NFL franchise, he built a staffing empire from a basement office with second-hand equipment. That background matters because it shaped how he evaluates leadership. Titles don't impress him. Longevity doesn't protect you. Results and direction do. That mindset showed up early in his ownership. When Bisciotti took full control of the Baltimore Ravens in 2004, he inherited a Super Bowl-winning coach in Brian Billick. On paper, firing Billick should have been unthinkable. A ring, credibility, locker room respect. But Bisciotti noticed something others ignored. The team felt stagnant. Player feedback wasn't aligning with public perception. And after a sharp decline following a 13-3 season, Bisciotti made a move most owners wouldn't dare. He fired Billick with years left on his contract. Years later, Bisciotti admitted that player input played a major role in that decision. He listened. He weighed what the locker room was telling him, and he acted, even when it meant eating millions of dollars and facing backlash. That moment defined his ownership philosophy. Bisciotti doesn't fire coaches because of one bad year. He fires them when he believes the organizational trajectory has flattened, when leadership stops evolving with the people it's meant to lead. That's why the events surrounding John Harbaugh weren't sudden. They were familiar. When Bisciotti listens to players, it's not symbolic. It's diagnostic. He's trying to understand whether the system still works, whether the message still lands, and whether the future can be built on the current foundation. And once he decides the answer is no, he doesn't hesitate. That's the part most fans miss. This wasn't an emotional betrayal or a reaction to pressure. It was the continuation of a pattern that's been in place for nearly 2 decades. Which brings us to the meeting John Harbaugh thought he survived, and why that belief would unravel within 24 hours. By the time John Harbaugh walked into the Ravens facility that Monday morning, the season was already over, but his job, he believed, wasn't. 18 years buys you a certain level of confidence, A Super Bowl buys you patience. And history suggested that if anyone in Baltimore had earned the benefit of the doubt, it was him. Waiting for Harbaugh were familiar faces: Eric DaCosta, senior executives and key decision-makers who had spent years working alongside him. The conversation was serious but not hostile. They talked about the season. They talked about missed opportunities. They talked about what needed to change. And importantly, Steve Bisciotti wasn't in the room. That detail mattered more than anyone realized at the time. According to reports, the tone of the meeting suggested adjustment, not upheaval. The word reset floated around, but not rebuild. The assumption inside the building was that Harbaugh would return, likely with some staff changes. Coordinators might be moved, roles might shift, but a full regime change, that felt extreme. Harbaugh left that meeting believing year 19 was still his. Maybe not comfortable, but intact. At worst, he'd have to make some hard decisions about his staff, something he'd done before. He went home thinking the organization would regroup, recalibrate, and move forward together. What he didn't know was that the real evaluation hadn't started yet. Because while Harbaugh was defending his vision inside conference rooms, Bisciotti was preparing to step outside the building entirely. Not to consult analysts, not to lean on public opinion, but to go directly to the people living inside the locker room every day. That Monday meeting wasn't a verdict, it was a pause. And in that pause, momentum quietly shifted. What looked like stability on the surface was masking growing uncertainty underneath. Executives were listening. Ownership was watching. And something about the answers Harbaugh gave, particularly about adaptability and future direction, didn't settle the questions already forming. By the end of that day, nothing had been decided, but the ground had started to move. Harbaugh didn't leave the building fired. He left believing he still had control. What he didn't realize was that, by the next afternoon, the conversation would no longer be about his plan. It would be about whether the locker room still believed in him at all. And once that door opened, it wouldn't close quietly. If Monday was about optics, Tuesday was about truth. While the coaching staff and front office processed the season internally, Steve Bisciotti did something he has quietly done at the most critical moments of his ownership tenure. He went directly to the players, not through formal surveys, not through filtered reports, through real conversations. This wasn't announced. There were no calendars blocked off. Bisciotti personally reached out to key members of the Baltimore Ravens roster and asked them one question in different ways: is this still working? Most owners never ask that, and even fewer want the honest answer. Some of those conversations happened over the phone. Others happened privately, away from the facility. But one interaction stood above the rest because it broke every unwritten rule in the NFL. A Ravens player drove to Bisciotti's home. Let that sink in. Players don't bypass head coaches, coordinators, and general managers lightly. Going straight to ownership is a last resort, a sign that something feels urgent, unresolved, and impossible to ignore. This wasn't about playing time or contract frustration. This was about the direction of the franchise itself. Inside that living room, Bisciotti didn't hear excuses. He heard concern. Multiple sources later described the feedback as consistent and sobering. The message wasn't angry, it was weary. Players spoke about leadership that no longer connected the way it once did, about meetings that felt repetitive, about communication that didn't always translate to the modern locker room. Younger players felt especially disconnected. Veterans felt like the edge that once defined the team had dulled. The issue wasn't effort or culture, it was evolution. And that's what made the moment so dangerous for John Harbaugh. Because once ownership hears the same concern from multiple voices, privately, independently, without coordination, it stops being noise. It becomes data. Bisciotti didn't rush to judgment, he listened. He compared what he was hearing to what he'd seen on the field. And slowly, a realization settled in. The problem wasn't a bad season. It was a message that had stopped landing. This wasn't mutiny. No one was calling for Harbaugh's head outright. But the underlying question was unmistakable. Could this staff still lead this roster forward? By the end of Tuesday afternoon, Bisiotti didn't need another meeting. He didn't need another report. The decision wasn't emotional, but it was heavy. Because once an owner realizes his locker room is drifting, loyalty stops being protection. And that's when everything accelerated fast. Once Steve Bisiotti began comparing notes, a pattern emerged, and it wasn't the kind you can explain away as frustration after a tough loss. The concerns coming from the locker room weren't emotional outbursts. They were measured, consistent, and deeply uncomfortable. Players didn't say John Harbaugh was a bad coach. That's what made it more damning. They said his message wasn't landing anymore. What once felt motivating now felt repetitive. What used to inspire urgency now felt predictable. Meetings that once energized the room had become routine, sometimes even contradictory. Players described hearing one thing early in the week and another by Sunday. For a locker room built on clarity and accountability, that erosion mattered. Younger players in particular felt disconnected, not rebellious, just unheard. The modern NFL locker room is different. Players expect collaboration. They expect adaptation. They expect their voices to matter beyond the depth chart. And according to multiple sources, that gap between leadership style and player expectation had quietly widened. Veterans felt it too. The edge that defined Ravens football, the relentless identity, the clear purpose, felt blurred. Not gone, but muted. The culture was still professional, but it no longer felt sharp. And this is where perception became reality. Because when enough core players start questioning whether leadership is evolving with them, it doesn't matter how successful the past was. Ownership has to decide whether nostalgia is outweighing progress. What made this situation especially dangerous for Harbaugh was the absence of a counter-narrative. No wave of players came forward to insist things were perfect. No unified defense of the status quo emerged. Silence filled those gaps, and silence speaks loudly in NFL decision rooms. This wasn't about rebellion, it was about belief. Belief that the message would change. Belief that the system would adjust. Belief that the future wouldn't look like a replay of the past few seasons. For Bisiotti, this was the tipping point. He had seen this before, in 2007. Same structure, same loyalty, same internal hesitation to move on from a Super Bowl winning coach, and the lesson he learned then came rushing back now. When leadership stops resonating, time doesn't fix it, change does. By the end of those conversations, Bisiotti wasn't asking whether Harbaugh deserved to stay. He was asking whether the Ravens could realistically move forward without altering the voice at the top. And that's when one issue rose above everything else, the one decision Harbaugh refused to make. Because locker room frustration alone doesn't end an era. But conflict with the franchise quarterback just might. Up until this point, everything Steve Bisiotti had heard was concerning but not fatal. Locker rooms get frustrated. Messages get stale. Cultures drift. Those problems can sometimes be fixed with adjustments, new voices on staff, or subtle changes in approach. But one issue refused to bend. And that's where the situation crossed the line from uncomfortable to untenable. The pressure point was Todd Monken. Throughout the season, tension between Monken and Lamar Jackson had quietly grown. Reports suggested the relationship wasn't toxic, but it was strained. Monken's hard-driving, demanding style didn't always mesh with Lamar's rhythm or communication preferences. Practice plans fluctuated. Injuries complicated availability, and the offensive identity that once looked explosive began to feel inconsistent. Ownership noticed. According to multiple reports, Biciotti believed the simplest path forward was obvious: change the coordinator, protect the franchise quarterback, and stabilize the offense. That's not unusual in the NFL. Coordinators are replaced every year to maximize elite quarterbacks. It's often the first lever ownership pulls. But John Harbaugh refused. Harbaugh stood firmly behind Monken. He defended the system. He defended the process. And most critically, he pushed responsibility back toward Lamar, suggesting durability, preparation, and execution mattered more than adjusting the staff. That stance changed everything. Because at that moment, Biciotti wasn't choosing between a coordinator and a quarterback. He was choosing between his coach's loyalty to his staff and his responsibility to the most important asset in the organization. Lamar Jackson isn't just another player. He's a two-time MVP. He's under contract through his prime. He represents the present and future of the franchise. When a quarterback of that magnitude expresses discomfort, directly or indirectly, ownership listens. Harbaugh's refusal wasn't insubordination. It was conviction. But in the modern NFL, conviction without flexibility is dangerous. Sources later suggested Harbaugh was so confident in Monken that he intended to bring him along to his next job. That detail matters. It confirmed to ownership that this wasn't a short-term disagreement. It was a philosophical divide. Biciotti was now cornered. If he sided with Harbaugh, he risked alienating his quarterback. If he sided with Lamar, he would have to sever an 18-year relationship. There was no compromise left. And once that reality set in, the decision stopped being about loyalty, legacy, or optics. It became about survival. Because in today's NFL, you don't gamble your future on preserving the past, especially when your franchise quarterback is quietly asking for a new direction. This was the moment Steve Biciotti had been trying to avoid, the point where there was no longer a middle ground. After listening to players, weighing the locker room drift, and hitting a wall with the coordinator issue, Biciotti was forced into the hardest decision an NFL owner can make. Choose the past or protect the future. On one side stood John Harbaugh, a coach who had given the Baltimore Ravens stability, credibility, and a championship. 18 years of trust, 18 years of shared success. Coaches like that don't come around often, and owners don't move on from them lightly. On the other side was Lamar Jackson, the franchise itself in human form, a two-time MVP, a generational talent, a quarterback whose prime years would define the next decade of Ravens football. When players like that speak, even indirectly, their voice carries weight that no resume can override. This wasn't about Lamar demanding a coach be fired. Reports have been careful to frame it differently. It's been said that frustrations were expressed, concerns were raised, and discomfort with the offensive direction became clear. That distinction matters, but from an ownership perspective, the message landed the same way. The quarterback wasn't aligned with the system. The coach wasn't willing to adjust the system. And the owner was stuck in between. In the modern NFL, that equation almost always ends the same way. Biciotti understood the risk. Firing Harbaugh meant destabilizing one of the league's most respected cultures. It meant public backlash. It meant second-guessing from fans who value loyalty. But keeping Harbaugh meant betting that Lamar would remain patient. And that patience is a fragile thing in a league that eats careers quickly. Ownership made its calculation. Quarterbacks win championships. Coaches, no matter how great, are replaceable. That's not sentiment, that's business. Once Biciotti accepted that reality, the emotional part was over. The decision wasn't personal anymore. It was structural. He wasn't erasing Harbaugh's legacy. He was prioritizing the franchise's next window. And that's why everything moved so fast. Because when an owner chooses a quarterback over a coach, there's no benefit in dragging it out. Uncertainty only creates fractures. The call had to be clean. decisive, final. What shocked the league wasn't that Bisiotti made the choice. It was how he delivered it. Because after 18 years, the end didn't come in a boardroom or an office. It came through a phone call, while a coach drove home, unaware that one era had already ended. After everything Steve Bisiotti had weighed, the player feedback, the quarterback tension, the refusal to adapt, the decision itself was no longer complicated. What no one expected was how it would be delivered. Late Tuesday afternoon, John Harbaugh was driving home from the Ravens facility, still under the impression that he'd be returning for year 19. His phone rang. On the other end was Bisiotti. And just like that, it was over. No office meeting. No final sit-down. No handshake inside the building where championships were celebrated and legacies were built. 18 years ended through a phone call. In NFL circles, that detail landed like a gut punch. Coaches get fired all the time, it's part of the business. But coaches with Harbaugh's resume usually get a face-to-face conversation. They get closure. They get respect for what they've built. This felt different. Cold, abrupt, final. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Fans flooded social media calling it ruthless, disrespectful, and unnecessary. Former players expressed shock. Analysts questioned how an organization known for class and stability could end one of the most successful tenures in league history without a proper goodbye. Inside the building, the shock was even heavier. Eric DeCosta, Harbaugh's longtime collaborator and close friend, was tasked with informing the coaching staff. According to reports, DeCosta struggled emotionally while delivering the news. Assistants were stunned. Some had learned about the firing through texts before any official word reached them. Within minutes, the story leaked. Players found out through social media alerts and group chats. There was no team meeting, no immediate explanation from ownership, just confusion, disbelief, and a sudden void where leadership had always been. 2 days later, Bisiotti and Harbaugh finally spoke in depth. By then, emotions had cooled, but the damage was already done. The way it ended became part of the story, not just the reason. From a business standpoint, Bisiotti likely believed speed was necessary. Prolonged goodbyes invite leaks. They invite pressure. They invite second thoughts. He chose efficiency over ceremony. But perception matters. And to many around the league, the manner of the dismissal overshadowed the logic behind it. What might have been viewed as a difficult but understandable football decision suddenly felt personal, even if it wasn't meant to be. Yet for Bisiotti, the call symbolized something else entirely. It marked a clean break. No hesitation. No half measures. No ambiguity about who the franchise was choosing to build around moving forward. And once that call ended, the Ravens weren't just without a head coach. They were officially in a new era, one defined not by loyalty, but by urgency. Because now, everything, Bisiotti's legacy included, rides on whether that cold decision produces the one thing that justifies it all. Another championship. When the dust finally settles, this story won't be remembered as just another coaching change. It will be remembered as the defining gamble of Steve Bisiotti's ownership. For nearly 2 decades, Bisiotti and John Harbaugh represented everything the Baltimore Ravens were supposed to stand for: stability, accountability, and sustained competitiveness. In a league built on chaos, they were the exception. One coach, one culture, one standard. And Bisiotti walked away from it. Not because Harbaugh forgot how to coach. Not because the Ravens suddenly became irrelevant. But because the organization reached a point where loyalty collided with leverage. That leverage belonged to Lamar Jackson. This wasn't about ultimatums or power grabs, at least not publicly. But in today's NFL, franchise quarterbacks don't need to demand change for change to happen. Their value speaks for them. Their timelines force decisions. And when alignment disappears between the quarterback and the coaching vision, owners are left with only one realistic option. Biciotti chose the future. He chose the player whose prime years are unfolding right now over the coach whose greatest years may already be written. That decision may end up looking visionary or reckless, but it will never be neutral. Because once you move on from a coach like Harbaugh, there's no undo button. If the Ravens win another Super Bowl with a new voice leading the team, this moment becomes proof of Biciotti's decisiveness. He'll be praised for listening, adapting, and refusing to let comfort stall progress. The phone call won't matter. The backlash will fade. History will smooth the edges. But if they do, if the locker room fractures, if the next coach fails to connect, if Lamar's window closes without a ring, then this decision becomes something else entirely. The moment stability was sacrificed for uncertainty. The moment an owner broke the very formula that made his franchise elite. That's the weight Biciotti now carries. Because firing a coach after 18 years isn't just about football. It's about identity, about what you value when success and stagnation start to look uncomfortably similar. The Ravens are officially in unfamiliar territory, a new era, a new voice, a new standard yet to be defined. And from this point forward, every win, every loss, every playoff exit or deep January run will trace back to one moment, when an owner chose urgency over history and bet that the future was worth the cost. Only time will decide if that bet pays off. But one thing is already clear. This wasn't just the end of John Harbaugh's tenure. It was the moment Steve Biciotti put his legacy on the line.